Good evening, everyone. Tonight, we descend into Ontario, a province of endless lakes and forgotten mining towns, where thick forests swallow sound and the cold presses against cabin walls like something living. These are not the stories you'll find in tourist brochures or history books. These are the accounts whispered in dive bars along Highway 11, the testimonies given to officers who stopped writing halfway through, the experiences that drove people from homes they'd lived in for generations. Ontario's wilderness is deceptive. It looks peaceful in the daylight, all those postcard lakes and quaint northern communities. But when winter locks down, when fog rolls across Superior's black water, when you're alone on a logging road that hasn't seen traffic in weeks, you begin to understand that this land keeps secrets. Old secrets. The kind that surface in the worst possible moments. These 10 stories come from real people, workers, residents, travelers, who encountered something that shouldn't exist. Some made it out, some didn't. All of them were changed. If you're drawn to the kind of truth that lingers in the dark, make sure to subscribe and stay with us tonight. The motion sensor camera captured something at 3:47 a.m. that shouldn't have been possible. I was sitting in the site office reviewing the overnight footage when I saw it. A figure standing perfectly still in frame Dove or 10, positioned exactly where our survey markers ended and the old growth forest began. The timestamp read November 3rd, but the problem was simple and absolute. There was no one on that property except me, and I'd been asleep in my truck a quarter mile away when that image was taken. The figure wasn't blurred by motion. It wasn't an animal caught mid-stride or a tree branch casting shadows. It was a person-shaped presence, and it was staring directly into the lens. My name is Marcus Webb. I'm 34, and I'd been working as a land surveyor for Northway Development for 6 years when this happened. The company had acquired a 400-acre parcel outside Chapleau for a planned logging operation, and my job was to map the terrain, mark boundaries, and document the property condition before the crews arrived. I'd done this work across Ontario 100 times. I was good at it. I didn't believe in ghosts, didn't buy into local folklore, and I certainly didn't expect to find anything on that job except rocks, trees, and the occasional deer. The property itself was beautiful in that stark northern way. Dense jack pine and black spruce, punctuated by granite outcrops and a series of small lakes that probably didn't even have names. The nearest town was Chapleau, population maybe 2,000, and even that was 40 minutes of rough road away. Perfect solitude for focused work. I'd arrived October 29th and set up a dozen motion sensor cameras across the property to document wildlife activity and verify there were no squatters or homeless encampments we'd need to address. Standard procedure. The cameras were good units, professional grade, and they'd been reliable on every job before this. The first 3 days were routine. I mapped the western boundary, took soil samples, documented a beaver dam on the northeast lake, and ate my dinners watching the sun set over water so still it looked like black glass. At night, I'd review the camera footage in my truck, mostly blank frames, the occasional fox or porcupine. Nothing worth noting. Then I checked the November 3rd footage. Frame Dove 10 showed that figure, standing at the tree line. The next frame, captured 3 seconds later, showed nothing. Empty forest. Like whoever, whatever, had been there simply vanished between captures. I told myself it was a malfunction, but my hands were shaking when I set the laptop down. That afternoon, I hiked out to camera site 10. It was a 20-minute walk from my truck, positioned near a cluster of dead birches that marked the old property line before Northway's purchase expanded the boundaries. The camera was still mounted securely to a pine trunk, undisturbed, exactly as I'd left it. But the ground in front of it had changed. There were impressions in the moss and pine needles, not quite footprints, but depressions shaped like someone had stood there for a very long time. The pattern matched the figure's position in the photo, and scratched into the tree bark beside the camera, crude and deliberate, was a symbol I didn't recognize. 3 lines intersecting at angles, forming something between a star and a warning. I photographed everything with my phone, then checked the other cameras. Sites 4, 7, and 11 had similar images. Different times. 1:22 a.m., 4:03 a.m., 2:56 a.m., but always the same impossibly still figure, always facing the camera, always vanishing in the next frame. And at each site, I found those same depressions in the earth, the same carved symbols. That night, I drove into Chapleau and found a bar called the Jack Pine. I wasn't looking for company, just a place with people and noise, somewhere that didn't feel like I was being watched. But when I mentioned the property location to the bartender, a woman named Louise Cartier, maybe 50, with the tired eyes of someone who'd lived there her whole life, she went very quiet. That land belonged to the Michaud family, she finally said. French-Canadian loggers, been there since the 1920s. Last of them, Denis Michaud, he disappeared in '98. Search and rescue spent 2 weeks looking. Never found a trace. Disappeared how? I asked. Louise wiped the bar slowly. His truck was parked at the cabin. Dinner was on the table, still warm. His coat was hanging by the door. He just wasn't there anymore. Some folks said he walked into the forest and didn't want to be found. Others said the forest took him. What do you mean, took him? She looked at me like she was deciding whether I was worth the truth. Dennis used to tell people the land was angry, said his grandfather had cut trees in a place they shouldn't have touched, and the forest remembered. He'd see things at night, figures walking the property line, symbols carved into trees that weren't there the day before. Last time anyone talked to him, he said he could hear drumming from the woods, but there was never anyone there. I felt cold, despite the bar's warmth. Did anyone ever figure out what the symbols meant? An Anishinaabe elder from the area looked at photos the police took, Louise said. Told them it was a boundary marker, old style, meant to warn people away from sacred ground. Dennis's grandfather must have built that logging camp right on top of something that should have been left alone. I went back to the property the next morning because I needed my equipment and I wasn't going to let fear dictate my job. But I wasn't stupid either. I packed everything systematically, working fast, and avoided looking toward the tree line. That's when I found the cabin. It wasn't on any of the maps or in the property documentation. Tucked into a small clearing, maybe half a mile from where I'd been camping. So overgrown I'd somehow missed it during my initial survey. The door hung open, and inside, everything was exactly as Louise had described. A table set for dinner, plates covered in years of dust and animal droppings, a coat on a hook, a calendar on the wall frozen at October 1998. And carved into every wall, ceiling to floor, were those symbols. Hundreds of them, overlapping, frantic, like someone had spent their final days trying to create protection that never came. In the back room, I found Denis Michaud's surveying equipment and his journal. I shouldn't have read it, but I did. The entries started normal: weather notes, logging plans, property observations. Then, around September 1998, the tone shifted. Saw someone at the north boundary again. Same spot as last week. When I called out, they didn't move, didn't respond, just stood there watching. By the time I got close enough to make out details, they were gone. The drumming is worse. It's not music, not rhythm. It's too slow, too deliberate. Sounds like it's coming from underground. Found my boundary markers pulled up and moved 20 feet west. All 12 of them. I reset them yesterday. This morning they'd been moved again. I know what this is now. Grandfather was warned and he didn't listen. He cut down the birches near the lake, the ones the old people said were watching trees. He built the cabin on ground that wasn't his to take. I've tried to make it right, carved the symbols the way I was told, but it's too late. They don't want offerings, they want the land back. The final entry was dated October 11, 1998. It came into the cabin last night, stood at the foot of my bed. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. It leaned down close enough that I should have felt breath on my face, but there was nothing, just cold, just the smell of earth and rot. When I finally could move again, it was gone. But I know it's not finished. I know it's waiting. That's where the journal ended. I took it. I took everything I could carry. My equipment, my cameras, Dennis's journal, and I drove straight out of there. I called my supervisor from Chapelot and told him I was done. The survey was incomplete, and I wouldn't be going back. When he pushed for a reason, I told him to send someone else if he wanted details. Northway Development abandoned the logging project 3 months later. Officially, it was due to environmental concerns and permit complications. But I talked to another surveyor who'd been sent to finish my work. He lasted 4 days before he packed out in the middle of the night. He wouldn't tell me what he saw, but he quit the company 2 weeks later. The motion sensor cameras are in a storage unit in Sudbury. I haven't looked at the footage since that November, and I never will. But sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I think about that figure standing at the tree line, staring into the lens. I think about Dennis Michaud carving symbols into his walls while something waited outside. I think about how easy it is to cross a boundary you don't even know exists until it's too late to step back. Officially, Dennis Michaud is still listed as a missing person. The land was never developed. I believe the forest took him, exactly like Louise said. I believe his grandfather cut down something that shouldn't have been touched, and Dennis spent his final years trying to undo damage that couldn't be undone. I don't survey in Northern Ontario anymore. I don't even drive through if I can avoid it. Because I know now that some boundaries aren't marked on maps. Some warnings aren't written in English, and some places will make you pay for trespasses you didn't even know you committed. If you work in the wilderness, if you develop land or cut timber or survey property lines, pay attention to what the locals tell you. Pay attention to the symbols carved into trees, because the forest remembers everything, and it's more patient than you'll ever be. The call button light for room 237 had been illuminated for 6 minutes, but room 237 was supposed to be empty. I was standing at the nurse's station, staring at the panel, watching that steady amber glow, trying to convince myself it was an electrical fault, even though I'd personally verified the room was vacant at the start of my shift. It was 2:30 a.m. on a Tuesday in February, the kind of deep winter night when the world outside the hospital felt like it had stopped existing entirely, and I was the only nurse on the 4th floor. The light stayed on, unwavering, waiting. My name is Hannah Broussard. I'm 29 and I'd been working night shifts at St. Margaret's Hospital in Thunder Bay for almost 3 years when this happened. St. Margaret's was old, built in 1957, expanded badly in the 80s, perpetually understaffed and underfunded. The 4th floor was long-term care and overflow, mostly elderly patients with dementia or people recovering from surgery who needed monitoring but not intensive intervention. It was usually quiet work, lonely but predictable. I'd requested night shifts specifically because I liked the solitude, the slower pace, the way time felt suspended between midnight and dawn. I was good at my job. I was calm in emergencies. I didn't spook easily. But room 237 had a reputation. It wasn't official, wasn't in any hospital records, but every nurse who'd worked 4th floor nights knew about it. The room had a history of call button activations when it was empty, equipment malfunctions, patients who stayed there reporting nightmares, or worse, claiming someone came into their room at night. Someone who wasn't staff, someone who stood at the foot of their bed and watched them with eyes that didn't reflect light. Most of us dismissed it as overactive imaginations combined with medication side effects and the general strangeness of being hospitalized. But there were enough incidents that nurses avoided assigning that room unless the floor was completely full. And we never, ever left patients in 237 alone overnight if we could help it. Tonight, the room was empty. Had been for 4 days, ever since a patient named Gerald Kimber had been discharged. I'd checked it myself at midnight during my rounds. Bed stripped, equipment removed, door closed, lights off. The call button shouldn't have been functional. I stood there for another 30 seconds, hoping the light would just turn off on its own. Would reveal itself as the glitch I desperately wanted it to be. But it didn't. Hospital protocol was clear. Respond to all call signals. Investigate all alerts. So I took a breath, left the nurse's station, and walked down the corridor toward 237. The 4th floor had that particular late-night hospital silence that's never really quiet. The hum of fluorescent lights, the distant wheeze of ventilation systems, the occasional beep from monitoring equipment in occupied rooms. My footsteps on the linoleum sounded too loud. Room 237 was at the end of the east hallway, the last door before the emergency stairwell. As I got closer, I noticed the temperature drop. Not dramatically, but enough to be noticeable. That specific cold that feels wrong, that makes your skin prickle with more than just chill. The door was closed. The light above it was dark, but the call panel still showed that amber glow, indicating someone inside had pressed the button. I knocked. "This is nursing, I'm coming in." No response. I opened the door. The room was dark except for the pale orange light filtering through the window from the parking lot below. Empty bed, stripped mattress, exactly as it should be. The call button hung on its cord beside the bed, and as I stepped inside, I could see it clearly. The button was depressed, pressed inward like someone was holding it down, but there was no one there. I crossed the room and touched the button, pulling it back to the neutral position. It clicked softly, and in the nurse's station down the hall, I knew the amber light would be going dark. That's when I smelled it. Tobacco smoke, old, stale cigarette smoke, the kind that clings to clothes and hair after years of chain smoking, distinct and undeniable. St. Margaret's had been smoke-free for decades. There was no reason for that smell to be in this room, in this sealed environment, in the middle of the night. I turned to leave, and the door swung shut behind me. Not slammed, not blown by wind or air pressure. It closed slowly, deliberately, with the smooth motion of someone pulling it shut from the other side. I heard the latch click. My heart was hammering now, but I kept my breathing steady. I grabbed the handle and tried to turn it. Locked. The door had no lock on the inside. Patient room doors in hospitals don't lock from within. It's a safety regulation. Prevents patients from barricading themselves during medical emergencies. The handle should have turned freely. Should have let me right out. It didn't move. I knocked. I called out. I tried my master key card in the external reader, even though it was designed for hallway access, not internal release. Nothing worked. The door was locked, and I was trapped in a room that was supposed to be empty, a room that smelled like smoke, a room where the temperature was still dropping. Behind me, I heard the bed creak. I didn't want to turn around. Every instinct told me to keep facing the door, keep working the handle, keep pretending that what I was hearing was just old springs settling, just the building's ancient infrastructure making noise. But the creak came again, deliberate and weighted, the sound of someone sitting down on the mattress. I turned. There was a man on the bed. He was thin, elderly, maybe 70 or 80, wearing a hospital gown that looked decades out of date, the old grey cotton kind with ties at the back, not the modern printed designs we use now. His skin was pale in the dim light, his face gaunt, and he was smoking a cigarette, the ember glowing orange in the darkness. He looked at me with eyes that were completely black, no whites, no iris, just solid darkness. And he smiled. "You're not supposed to smoke in here," I said, and I don't know why those were the words that came out. except that my brain was trying desperately to impose normalcy on something that had no normal explanation. The man took a long drag from his cigarette, and the ember brightened, illuminating his face in sharp relief. His teeth were too long, his smile too wide. When he exhaled, the smoke didn't dissipate. It hung in the air, thick and oily, forming shapes I didn't want to examine too closely. "Room's mine," he said, and his voice was a wet rasp, like words spoken through damaged lungs. "Always been mine." I backed against the door, my hand scrabbling for the handle behind me. "This room is unoccupied. You need to—" "They keep bringing people in," he interrupted. "Keep putting them in my bed. I don't like that. Don't like strangers in my space." "Who are you?" I managed to ask. He took another drag, the ember flaring. "Used to be Harold Vance. Used to be alive. Then the doctors got it wrong, and I wasn't anymore. But I stayed. This is my room. Always will be." I remembered the name. Remembered the story because it was part of fourth-floor folklore, the kind of tale older nurses told newer ones during slow shifts. Harold Vance had died in room 237 in 1984. A respiratory failure case that should have been straightforward. But something had gone wrong during his treatment. A medication error, a delayed response to crisis. The details depended on who told the story. He died alone in that room in the early hours of the morning, and ever since, nurses reported things. "You need to let me out," I said, keeping my voice level. "I'm just doing my job. I'm not bothering you." Harold's smile didn't waver. "You're in my room. You're standing in my space. That bothers me." The temperature had dropped so far now that I could see my breath. My fingers were going numb. The smell of smoke was overwhelming, choking, making it hard to breathe. "I'll leave," I said. "I'll make sure no one bothers you. Just let me out." Harold stood up slowly, the bed creaking with the shift of his weight, and he walked toward me. His movements were wrong. Too smooth, like he was gliding rather than walking, like his feet weren't quite touching the floor. The cigarette dangled from his lips, ash falling and vanishing before it reached the ground. He stopped inches away from me, close enough that I should have felt body heat, felt breath, felt anything human, but there was nothing except cold and the choking reek of smoke. 37 people I've watched," he whispered, his black eyes fixed on mine. 37 people in my bed, in my space, and I've been patient. I've been quiet, but I'm tired now, tired of sharing." He reached out, and his hand passed through my chest like I was made of air. I felt it. Felt cold spreading through my rib cage. Felt something icy wrapping around my heart, squeezing. My legs buckled, and I collapsed against the door, gasping, my vision narrowing to a tunnel of darkness with Harold's face at the center. Then, from somewhere distant, I heard voices, shouting, pounding on the door. Harold's expression flickered, something like frustration crossing his gaunt features. The pressure around my heart released, and he stepped back, the cigarette falling from his lips and vanishing before it hit the floor. "Next time," he said. "Next time you come into my room alone, I'm not letting you leave." The door burst open behind me, and I fell backward into the hallway, into the light, into the arms of Dr. Patel, one of the residents who'd been checking on a patient 3 doors down and heard me calling out, "Hannah, what happened? Are you okay?" I was shaking, gasping for air, my chest aching where Harold's hand had passed through. "The room," I managed. "Someone was in the room." Dr. Patel looked past me into 237. "It's empty. There's no one there." But I could still smell the smoke, could still feel the cold radiating from that space. They took me to the ER, ran tests, found nothing physically wrong except mild hypothermia and a racing heart. I told them I'd had a panic attack, blamed it on exhaustion and stress, didn't mention Harold Vance or black eyes or hands passing through flesh. I finished my shift because I needed the hours, But I didn't go near room 237 again that night, or any night after. Officially, St. Margaret's Hospital maintains that room 237 is like any other patient room. There are no documented paranormal incidents, no maintenance issues beyond the typical wear of an aging building. But talk to the nurses who work nights. Ask them which room they avoid assigning. Ask them why. I transferred to day shifts 3 weeks after that night. I make less money, work less convenient hours, but I never have to walk that 4th floor hallway in the dark. Never have to see that amber coal light glowing from an empty room. I believe Harold Vance is still there. I believe he's possessive of that space, angry about what happened to him, and that he's been patient for decades, but that patience is running out. If you're ever admitted to St. Margaret's Hospital in Thunder Bay, if they try to put you in room 237, refuse, request a different room, make a scene if you have to, because some places hold on to their dead, and some of the dead aren't ready to let go. The hole in the ice was too perfect. I'd been drilling test holes on Lac Seul for 3 hours, mapping ice thickness for the annual fishing derby, and every hole I'd made was rough-edged, ringed with the spray and fracture patterns that come from mechanically boring through 18 inches of frozen lake. But this hole was different. The edges were smooth, almost polished, and it was perfectly circular, like something had melted through from underneath rather than being cut from above. And it was warm. Standing near it, I could feel heat rising from the black water below, enough to melt the frost on my gloves. My name is Colin Thatcher. I'm 41, and I'd been working as a lake safety coordinator for the Sioux Lookout region for 8 years when I found that hole. My job was straightforward: test ice thickness before big events, mark unsafe areas, make sure people didn't drive their trucks onto sections that couldn't support the weight. It was good work, outdoors, independent, and usually peaceful. January 2019 was a hard winter, even by Northern Ontario standards. Temperatures had been sitting at -30 Celsius for weeks, and Lac Seul, one of the largest lakes in the province, was locked down solid. The fishing derby was scheduled for the last weekend of the month, expecting maybe 400 participants, and I'd been out every day for a week, checking conditions. Everything had been fine until I found that hole. It was located about half a mile from shore, in a section of the lake locals called the Deep Drop, a place where the bottom fell away to over 200 feet, one of the deepest points on Lac Seul. There were old ice fishing shacks scattered across this part of the lake, semi-permanent structures that people towed out at the start of winter and left until spring melt. Most were simple plywood boxes with benches and holes cut through the floor for fishing. The warm hole was directly in front of one of these shacks. The structure itself looked old, more weathered than the others, with faded green paint and a door that hung slightly crooked on its hinges. No vehicle tracks led to it, no fresh footprints in the snow. It looked abandoned, forgotten. I should have marked the hole as a hazard and moved on. That was my job. But the wrongness of it, the perfect edges, the rising heat, pulled at me. I wanted to understand what I was looking at. I approached the shack and knocked on the door. No response. I called out. Silence. I opened the door. The interior was dark except for the pale blue light coming through the fishing hole cut in the floor. There was a bench, a small propane heater that wasn't running, a tackle box, a rod leaning against the wall. Everything covered in frost except immediately around the floor hole, where the air was warm, almost humid. And there was a smell. Not decay, not exactly, but something organic and wrong. Like thawed meat, like the scent of a body left too long in warmth. The floor hole was identical to the one I'd found outside, perfectly smooth, unnaturally circular, with black water visible below. But something was floating in it. I knelt down carefully, shining my flashlight into the water. There was a face looking back at me, not a reflection, a face beneath the ice, pressed up against the underside, eyes wide open. mouth slack, skin gray-white and bloated. A man, maybe 50 or 60, wearing a heavy winter coat and a toque, suspended in the water like he'd been frozen there. I jerked back, my heart slamming against my ribs, and the flashlight slipped from my hand. It hit the edge of the hole and tumbled in, the beam spiraling down through dark water until it vanished into the depths. I scrambled out of the shack, yanking out my radio to call it in, but my hands were shaking so badly I dropped it. And that's when I heard the sound. Tapping, rhythmic and deliberate. Metal on ice. It was coming from inside the shack. I froze, listening. Tap, 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 slow and steady, like someone knocking to be let in. But I'd just been inside that shack. It was empty, except for the body in the water. Tap, tap, tap. I retrieved my radio, backed away from the shack, and called for emergency response. I told dispatch I'd found a body, gave coordinates, requested police and dive recovery. My voice sounded thin and strained over the radio, not like me at all. While I waited, I didn't take my eyes off that shack. The tapping continued, methodical, patient. OPP and recovery divers arrived 90 minutes later. I led them to the shack, explained what I'd seen, warned them about the hole. The officers exchanged glances, the kind of look that said they thought I was either mistaken or exaggerating, but they suited up and went inside. They were in there less than 30 seconds before one of them came out fast, ripping his face mask off, gasping. Jesus Christ, there's someone under there, multiple people. The dive team went down through that smooth, warm hole. And over the next 6 hours, they recovered 5 bodies from the water beneath the shack. All of them had been reported missing over the past 12 winters. Ice fishermen who'd gone out alone, who'd never come home. The searchers had found abandoned shacks, holes in the ice, but no bodies. The assumption had always been that they'd fallen through, been swept under the ice by current, carried away to some dark corner of the lake where they'd never be found. But there were no currents beneath that shack. The water there was still, trapped in the deep drops basin, and the bodies hadn't drifted there naturally. They'd been arranged, positioned in a circle beneath the ice, their hands reaching toward the center, toward the hole, like they'd been placed there deliberately, like someone had drowned them one by one and set them in formation, creating something that looked less like tragedy and more like ritual. The oldest body was Thomas Brightwater, an Anishinaabe fisherman who disappeared in 2007. The most recent was Michael Rupert, missing just 4 months earlier, in September 2018. All men, all experienced with ice conditions, all last seen heading to that same section of the deep drop. During the recovery, one of the divers, a woman named Justine Pelletier, pulled me aside. She looked shaken, and Justine was former military, had done body recoveries in Afghanistan, wasn't someone who spooked easily. "The bottom down there," she said quietly. "Below where we found them. There are marks in the silt, tracks maybe, or patterns. They spiral out from directly under this shack, going deeper, like something large moved across the lake bed." "Something like what?" I asked. She shook her head. "I don't know, but whatever made those tracks, it's big. And the tracks lead to a crevasse we couldn't see the bottom of. My depth gauge was reading over 300 feet when we had to turn back." Lac Seul's official depth charts max out at 215 feet in the deep drop area. The OPP investigation concluded that the deaths were accidental drownings, that the bodies had somehow been moved post-mortem by underwater currents or animal activity, and coincidentally clustered in that location. The smooth holes were attributed to thermal venting from geothermal activity on the lake bed, though no geological surveys confirmed such activity existed. The shack was removed and destroyed. The area was marked as off-limits for ice fishing. But I talked to people in Sioux Lookout, dug into local stories, and I learned things that never made it into official reports, as that section of Lac Seul has a name in Anishinaabe Mowin, the local indigenous language. Mishibiju Zaga Igan. It translates roughly to Lake of the Underwater Panther. Mishibiju is a creature from Anishinaabe tradition, a powerful, dangerous spirit that lives in deep water, associated with drowning and sickness and bad fortune. Offerings were traditionally made to appease it, to ensure safe passage across the lake, safe fishing, safe living near its territory. Those offerings stopped decades ago when the old ways faded, when people stopped believing. An elder named William Bouchard, who'd grown up on the shores of Lac Seul, told me his grandfather used to leave tobacco and fish at that specific spot every winter. He said something lived in the deep drop, William explained. Something that got hungry when the ice locked down, when it couldn't reach the fish near the surface anymore. He said you could fish there if you respected it, if you brought offerings and spoke the proper words. But if you just took without asking, without giving back, it would remember. It would take what it was owed. The 5 men who died had all been fishing that area repeatedly, season after season, pulling up lake trout and walleye from the deep drop's rich waters. None of them had left offerings. None of them had asked permission. I don't work lake safety anymore. I quit 3 months after the recovery, told my supervisor it was for personal reasons, didn't elaborate. I couldn't keep going out on that ice, couldn't keep drilling holes and measuring thickness while knowing what I knew. Officially, the Lac Seul deaths were accidental. Officially, there's no creature in the deep drop, no spirit that demands respect and payment. But I remember the tapping inside that empty shack. I remember the heat rising from that perfect hole. I remember 5 bodies arranged in a circle beneath the ice, reaching towards something in the center, something in the depths. I believe Mishibiju is real. I believe it was owed and it took payment. If you fish northern Ontario lakes, if you drill through the ice above deep water, especially in places with old names and old languages, ask yourself, what are you taking and what are you giving back? Because some debts don't disappear just because you stop believing in them. The pool was full. That's what I noticed first, standing on the cracked concrete deck of Cedar Ridge Resort, staring at the swimming pool that shouldn't have contained a single drop of water. The place had been abandoned for 6 years, left to rot after the owners declared bankruptcy in 2012, and I was there to do a site assessment for potential buyers. Abandoned pools don't stay full. They crack, they drain, they fill with leaves and rainwater and filth. This one was full of clear blue water, perfectly still, like someone had filled it yesterday and added chlorine. My name is Amanda Voss. I'm 36, and I work as a property inspector for Lakeshore Commercial Real Estate in Kenora. My job involves touring vacant buildings, assessing structural integrity, documenting hazards, and providing recommendations for renovation or demolition. I've walked through dozens of abandoned properties across northwestern Ontario. Old motels, closed schools, bankrupt businesses. I've never been bothered by decay or isolation. I find it interesting, actually, seeing how buildings collapse into themselves when people leave. Cedar Ridge Resort was located on Lake of the Woods, about 20 kilometers outside Kenora, on a dead-end road that hadn't seen regular traffic in years. It had been a family vacation spot in its heyday. 15 cabins, a main lodge, a restaurant, a small marina, and that pool. But tourism shifted. Competition increased, maintenance costs piled up, and eventually the place just died. I arrived on a gray afternoon in March 2018, snow still heavy on the ground, temperature hovering around 0. The access road was barely passable, and I had to park 100 meters back and hike in. The resort looked like something from a post-apocalyptic movie. Windows shattered, roofs caved in, walls covered in graffiti, nature slowly reclaiming everything. But that pool was pristine. I stood there for a long moment, trying to make sense of it. The water was crystal clear, not a leaf on the surface, not a crack in the tiles. I could see the bottom perfectly. The painted lines, the depth markers, the drain covers. It looked operational, maintained, impossible. I crouched down and dipped my fingers into the water. It was warm, not cold, not frigid lake water or melted snow. Warm, like a heated pool, like someone was running a system to keep it comfortable for swimmers. I pulled my hand back and wiped it on my jeans, my mind racing through explanations. Underground spring, thermal anomaly, but nothing rational fit. Abandoned properties don't have functioning heating systems, don't have water circulation, don't have pools that maintain themselves. I took photos, documented the anomaly in my notes, and moved toward the main lodge to continue my inspection. But as I walked, I kept glancing back at that pool, at the water that refused to ripple in the wind, at the perfect blue that didn't belong. The lodge interior was what I expected. Trashed, vandalized, stripped of anything valuable. Water damage, mold, collapsed ceilings. The restaurant kitchen was a disaster of rust and decay. The guest rooms were full of broken furniture and animal nests. Standard abandonment. But in the office behind the front desk, I found something that wasn't standard. A logbook. Recent entries. The book was sitting open on the desk, pages yellowed but not destroyed, handwriting clear and dated. The entries ran from May through September 2017, less than a year before my visit. Someone had been here, living here, or at least visiting regularly, and they'd been keeping records. The early entries were mundane. May 15th, 2017, arrived at property, conditions as expected, beginning setup in cabin 7. May 22, 2017, water system responding, pool clear, good progress. June 3rd, 2017, first successful contact. It's aware, it's listening. The tone shifted after that entry. Less clinical, more obsessive. June 10th, 2017, it showed itself in the water. Didn't breach the surface, but I saw the shape moving below, larger than I expected. Didn't match descriptions. June 18th, 2017, communication is improving. It wants something specific. Needs to understand I'm here to help. July 4th, 2017, offering accepted. Water stayed warm all night. Felt it watching from the deep end. July 29th, 2017, dreams are getting worse. It's inside my head now. Shows me things from the lake, from before the resort, from when this land was different. It's angry about the buildings, about the people. Wants them gone. August 19th, 2017. Can't leave anymore. It won't let me. Every time I try to drive away, I end up back at the pool. It's keeping me here. The final entry was dated September 11th, 2017. It's in the cabins now. I hear it moving at night, dragging itself through the buildings. I thought I could control this, thought I could communicate and make peace. But it doesn't want peace. It wants the resort erased. It wants everyone who ever came here to be forgotten. And it wants me to stay. Forever. That's where the entries stopped. I stood in that office, holding the logbook, my skin crawling. I didn't know who'd written it. Didn't know if they were delusional or documenting something real. But the pool outside was full and warm, and this logbook suggested someone had been trying to communicate with something in the water, something that had ultimately trapped them. I should have left immediately. Should have walked out of that lodge, gotten in my car, and reported what I'd found to the police. But I needed to check the cabins. I needed to know if there was evidence of who'd been here, if they were still here, if any of this was real. Cabin 7 was the furthest from the lodge, tucked into the trees near the shoreline. The door was ajar, and inside it was clear someone had been living there recently. Camping gear, canned food, a sleeping bag, a laptop with a dead battery. On the walls, dozens of photos were taped up, pictures of the pool taken at different times of day, different angles. And in many of them, if you looked closely at the deep end, there was something beneath the surface. Not clear, not defined, but a dark mass, a suggestion of size and movement. There was a name written on the laptop case, Dr. Raymond Keegan. I didn't recognize it at the time, but later I looked him up. Raymond Keegan had been a folklore researcher from University of Winnipeg, specialized in indigenous water spirits and lake legends. He'd gone missing in September 2017, last known location somewhere near Kenora. His car had been found abandoned on a rural road, but there'd been no sign of him. Now I knew where he'd been, what he'd been trying to do. I took the logbook and the laptop, and I left Cabin 7. It was late afternoon now, light fading, and I wanted to get back to my car before dark. But as I passed the pool, I stopped. Something was in the water, not floating on the surface. Beneath it, in the deep end, a shape that hadn't been there before. Large, elongated, moving with slow, deliberate motion. I couldn't make out details, but I could see it clearly enough to know it was massive, far too large to be a fish or animal that should exist in a pool. It rose slowly toward the surface, and I saw ridges along its back, something like scales or plating, a suggestion of limbs or appendages. Then it turned, and I saw eyes. Huge, pale, unblinking eyes that fixed on me with unmistakable intelligence. I ran. I didn't think, didn't rationalize, just dropped everything except my car keys and sprinted for the access road. Behind me, I heard water sloshing, a heavy, wet sound like something dragging itself out of the pool, moving across concrete. I didn't look back. I reached my car, fumbled with the keys, got the engine started and the transmission in reverse. I backed down that road faster than I've ever driven in reverse in my life, fishtailing and skidding, not stopping until I hit the main highway. I drove straight to the Kenora OPP detachment and reported what I'd found. They sent officers out the next day with search and rescue personnel. They found Cedar Ridge Resort exactly as abandoned properties should be found. Decayed, dangerous, empty. The pool was cracked and dry, filled with 3 feet of brown ice and dead leaves. No water, no warmth, no creature. They found Cabin 7, found the camping gear, found evidence someone had been living there, but no laptop, no logbook, no photos on the walls. Raymond Keegan's missing person case remains unsolved. The property assessment I was supposed to complete never happened. The potential buyers withdrew their offer, and Cedar Ridge Resort still sits empty, slowly collapsing into Lake of the Woods. Officially, I documented the site as unsuitable for development due to structural decay and potential environmental hazards. I never mentioned the pool, the logbook, or what I saw in the water, but I believe Raymond Keegan was documenting something real. I believe there's something in Lake of the Woods, something old and territorial, something that resented Cedar Ridge Resort being built on its shoreline. And I believe it kept Keegan there, showed him things, used him to maintain the pool, and eventually took him when he tried to leave. I don't inspect abandoned properties near water anymore. I stay inland, stay away from lakes with indigenous names and old histories, because some places are abandoned for good reason, and sometimes the reason is still there, waiting in the deep end, watching with pale eyes, ready to pull you under. If you explore abandoned resorts or lakeside properties, pay attention to things that shouldn't work. If the pool is full when it should be dry, if the water is warm when it should be frozen, don't investigate. Don't document it. Just leave. Some places maintain themselves because something wants them that way. And you don't want to find out why. The truck was parked perfectly on the side of the road, hazard lights still flashing, driver's door wide open, keys in the ignition. But there was no driver. No signs of struggle, no footprints leading away into the forest, no blood, no indication of where the person had gone or why they'd abandoned a running vehicle in the middle of nowhere. I was responding to a call about an abandoned truck on Service Road 804, a remote forestry access route about 60 kilometers north of Sault Ste. Marie. It was October 2016, late afternoon, the kind of grey autumn day when the light seems to drain away faster than it should, and I was the only OPP officer available in that sector. My name is Derek Holloway. I'm 43, and I'd been an Ontario Provincial Police Constable for 17 years when I got that call. My territory covered a huge swath of wilderness, hundreds of square kilometers of forest, lakes, and logging roads, places where you could drive for an hour without seeing another vehicle. I was used to isolation, used to strange calls, used to finding logical explanations for things that initially seemed inexplicable. But Service Road 804 was different from the start. The truck was a grey Ford F-150, fairly new, registered to a man named Kyle Brennan, age 34, a timber cruiser working for one of the forestry companies operating in the area. The vehicle was clean, well-maintained, nothing immediately suspicious. But it was running, engine on, hazards flashing, heat on full blast, like Kyle had stepped out expecting to be right back. His phone was on the passenger seat. His wallet was in the cup holder. His jacket was folded neatly on the back seat, even though the outside temperature was barely above freezing. I did a perimeter check, calling his name, looking for tracks. The road was gravel, the forest floor thick with fallen leaves, and there should have been obvious signs if someone had walked into the trees. But there was nothing. The leaves were undisturbed, no broken branches, no scuff marks, no indication anyone had left that truck on foot. I radioed dispatch, reported the situation, and requested backup. But backup was over an hour away, and daylight was fading fast. I needed to do a preliminary search before it got dark. I walked the road in both directions, checking for any clue about where Kyle might have gone. Service Road 804 ran straight for about 2 kilometers in each direction from where the truck was parked, cutting through dense boreal forest, spruce, pine, birch, the kind of landscape that looks the same in every direction, easy to get disoriented if you're not experienced. About 300 meters north of the truck, I found the first marker. It was a small cairn of rocks, stacked deliberately on the side of the road with something on top, a piece of orange surveyor's tape, tied in a specific pattern. I recognized it as a forestry marker, the kind timber cruisers use to mark boundaries or points of interest, but the pattern was wrong. It wasn't standard. The tape was folded and tied in a way I'd never seen before, almost like a symbol or warning. I photographed it and kept walking. Over the next kilometer, I found 6 more cairns, each one with that same strange tape pattern, each one spaced exactly 50 meters apart. They led deeper into the forest, away from the road, into an area where no logging operations should have been active. At the 7th cairn, the trail stopped. The forest opened into a small clearing, maybe 20 meters across, and in the center was a hole in the ground. Not a natural sinkhole or animal burrow. A dug hole, roughly circular, about 2 meters in diameter, with smooth sides that angled down into darkness. The excavated earth was piled neatly around the perimeter, and at the edge of the hole there were tools, a shovel, a pickaxe, a coil of rope. All clean, barely used, arranged like someone had finished work and stepped away for a moment. I approached carefully, pulled out my flashlight, and shone it down into the hole. It was deep. My flashlight beam couldn't find the bottom. I dropped a rock in and counted seconds. 8 seconds before I heard it hit something far below, a dull thud against stone or wood. That was over 300 meters down, impossibly deep for a hand-dug hole. I radioed my findings to dispatch, requested a search and rescue team and spelunking specialists. Then I secured the area and waited. That's when I heard the sound. It came from the hole, a low, rhythmic tapping like metal striking rock. Slow and deliberate, echoing up from the depths. Tap, tap, tap. the same interval, over and over. I backed away from the hole, my hand on my sidearm, even though I knew a gun would be useless against whatever was making that sound. The tapping continued, steady and patient, and as it did, I noticed something else. The forest around the clearing was completely silent. No birds, no insects, no wind moving through the trees. Just that tapping, rising from the depths. I stayed at the edge of the clearing until backup arrived. 2 other officers and a search coordinator from Sault Ste. Marie. By then, it was full dark, and we had to work under portable floodlights. The tapping had stopped, but the silence remained, oppressive and wrong. The search team examined the hole, measured its depth with laser equipment, and determined it was at least 400 meters deep, descending at a steep angle into bedrock. Geologically, it made no sense. That depth couldn't have been achieved with hand tools, and there were no excavation permits for that area. No reason anyone should have been digging there. We found Kyle Brennan's body 3 days later. It was at the bottom of the hole. The recovery team rappelled down, navigating a narrow shaft that widened into a small cavern at the 400-meter mark. Kyle was there, broken from the fall, but the disturbing part wasn't how he died. It was the evidence that he'd been down there for much longer than 3 days. His body showed signs of advanced decomposition, inconsistent with the timeline. His clothes were rotted, his equipment corroded. The forensic pathologist estimated he'd been dead at least 6 months, possibly longer. But that was impossible. Kyle's employer confirmed he'd been working as recently as the day he disappeared, October 14th, 2016. His co-workers had seen him that morning. He'd radioed in status updates throughout the day. And yet, his body showed 6 months of decay. There was something else. Carved into the rock walls of the cavern surrounding Kyle's body were symbols, hundreds of them, overlapping and intricate, covering every surface. The forensic team photographed them, sent images to cultural experts and academics, trying to identify their origin. An anthropologist from Algoma University, Dr. Sarah Whitestone, examined the photos and confirmed they were old, pre-contact indigenous petroglyphs, styles associated with burial sites and spirit barriers. She said the symbols were meant to contain something, to prevent it from leaving the earth. These are warning markers, Dr. Whitestone explained when I spoke to her months later. They're telling anyone who sees them not to disturb what's below, not to break the seal. Whoever dug that hole, they broke through a sacred containment. They opened something that was closed for a reason. The official OPP report concluded that Kyle Brennan had been digging on his own time, possibly looking for minerals or artifacts, and had fallen into the excavation he'd created. The discrepancy in decomposition was attributed to unusual environmental conditions in the cavern: moisture, temperature, microorganisms. The petroglyphs were noted as an archaeological find, unrelated to the death. But I talked to Kyle's co-workers, to the other timber cruisers who'd worked that territory. They told me Kyle had become obsessed in the weeks before he vanished. Said he'd found something in the forest, something he called the old place, and that he was convinced there was something important buried there, something valuable or powerful. They said he'd been hearing things while working alone. Voices calling from underground, tapping sounds coming from beneath the forest floor, and they said he wasn't the first person to hear those sounds in that area. Service Road 804 was closed to non-essential traffic after the incident. The hole was filled in, the area marked as hazardous, and the forestry company suspended operations in that sector indefinitely. But I've spoken to locals, to Anishinaabe elders who know the old stories about that region. They tell me there are places in the forest where the earth is thin, where boundaries between worlds grow weak, and where things that should stay buried sometimes call to the living, luring them down, trapping them in spaces where time moves differently. They say the symbols on those rocks were placed there generations ago to keep something contained, and that breaking through, digging down past the warnings, wakes it up, angers it. Officially, Kyle Brennan's death was accidental, caused by his own reckless excavation. But I believe he heard something calling from below. I believe he dug through a barrier meant to protect people like him, and that when he broke through, he fell into a place where time doesn't work the way it should, where 6 months can pass in 3 days, where the dead don't decay the way they're supposed to. I don't patrol Service Road 804 anymore. I requested a territory change, moved south to more populated areas. Because I remember that tapping sound rising from the depths, remember the silence in the forest, remember the feeling that something far below was aware of me, watching me, waiting to see if I'd be curious enough to climb down. If you work in remote forests, if you find excavations or holes that shouldn't be there, if you hear sounds coming from underground, don't investigate. Don't try to understand it. Some barriers are in place because what's below is worse than what's above. And once you break through, you can't unopen what you've exposed. The woman in the lobby didn't blink. That's what I noticed after about 30 seconds of conversation. Her eyes were wide and glassy, fixed on my face, and she hadn't blinked once. Not when I asked about a room, not when I explained I'd be staying just one night, not when she handed me the key and told me room 12 was at the far end. She just stared, unblinking, her smile too wide and too constant. My name is Jason Merrick. I'm 38, and I'm a long-haul trucker running routes between Thunder Bay and Ottawa. I've been driving for 15 years, and I've stayed at every kind of roadside accommodation you can imagine. Chain motels, truck stops, questionable inns with flickering vacancy signs. You learn to judge places quickly in this job, to know when somewhere feels off, when it's better to keep driving and sleep in the cab. But it was February 2020, middle of a vicious cold snap, and I'd been on the road for 11 hours when I saw the Cedar Motor Lodge sign glowing through the snow on Highway 17, about 40 kilometers west of Mattawa. I was exhausted, freezing, and not thinking clearly. I just wanted a bed and heat. I should have kept driving. The motel was a long, single-story building, classic 1970s roadside layout, with rooms that opened directly to the parking lot. Maybe 20 units total, though only one other car was in the lot besides mine, a rust-eaten sedan near the office. The neon vacancy sign buzzed and flickered, casting pink light across the snow. Inside the office, it was overheated to the point of discomfort, and the woman behind the counter was probably 60, wearing a floral dress that looked decades out of style. Her hair was perfectly curled, her makeup thick, and her expression was locked in that unwavering smile. "Room for the night?" she asked, her voice bright and cheerful and slightly wrong, like someone trying very hard to sound normal. "Yeah, just one night. Single bed is fine." She nodded, still smiling, still not blinking, and pulled a key from the board behind her. "Room 12, far end. Quiet, very quiet." I paid cash, took the key, and walked back out into the cold. Room 12 was indeed at the far end, separated from the office by a stretch of empty parking spaces. The room's curtains were drawn, but I could see light leaking around the edges, like someone had left a lamp on inside. I unlocked the door and stepped into a space that looked like it had been frozen in time. Floral bedspread, wood-paneled walls, a bulky TV with dials instead of buttons, furniture that might have been considered modern in 1978. Everything was clean, though, almost obsessively so, and the heater was running at full blast. I dropped my bag, locked the door, and collapsed onto the bed. I intended to shower, maybe watch TV for a bit, but exhaustion hit me hard. I was asleep within minutes. I woke to knocking. Soft, polite, persistent. 3 knocks, a pause, then 3 more. I checked my phone. 2:47 a.m. The knocking continued. Knock, knock, knock. Pause. Knock, knock, knock. I got up, assuming it was the woman from the office with some issue about payment or a problem with the room. But when I looked through the peephole, There was no one there. The parking lot outside was empty, snow falling steadily under the flickering lot lights. The knocking continued, but now I could tell it wasn't coming from my door. It was coming from the wall adjoining room 11. I pressed my ear against the thin paneling and listened. The knocking was rhythmic, deliberate, like someone on the other side hitting the wall with their knuckles in a specific pattern. 3 knocks. Pause. 3 knocks. "Hey," I called out. "You okay over there?" The knocking stopped immediately. Silence. Then, from the other side of the wall, a voice. Quiet, strained, desperate. "Don't sleep. Don't let yourself sleep." I pulled back from the wall, my skin prickling. "What?" "The woman. She's not right. None of this is right. You need to leave. Now, before she comes." "Before who comes?" Silence again. Then, "It's too late for me. I slept. I've been here so long, but you can still get out. Don't sleep. Don't close your eyes." I backed away from the wall, my heart racing. This had to be a prank, someone messing with the trucker in the end room, bored locals having fun. But the voice had sounded terrified. Genuine. I grabbed my jacket and walked outside, the cold hitting me like a slap. I checked the parking lot. My truck, the rusted sedan, no other vehicles. I walked to room 11 and knocked. No answer. I tried the handle. Locked. I knocked again, harder. "Hey, I just want to make sure you're okay." Nothing. I walked back toward the office, intending to ask the woman about whoever was in room 11, but the office was dark now, the open sign turned off. Through the window, I could see the woman sitting behind the counter in the darkness, perfectly still, that same wide smile on her face, eyes open and staring at nothing. She wasn't moving at all. Wasn't breathing as far as I could tell, just sitting there in the dark, frozen like a mannequin. I went back to my room, locked the door, and wedged a chair under the handle. I wasn't sleeping anymore. I sat on the bed with my phone in hand, trying to decide if I should call the police, trying to rationalize what I'd seen. That's when I heard the footsteps. Slow, heavy footsteps moving along the sidewalk outside, passing each room in sequence. They paused at each door. I could hear the slight change in sound as whoever was walking stopped, stood still, then moved on. The footsteps reached my door and stopped. I held my breath, staring at the door, at the small gap beneath it where I could see the shadow of someone standing outside. The handle turned. Slowly, testing, finding it locked. Then the knocking started. 3 knocks. Pause. 3 knocks. "Jason Merrick," a voice said from outside. Female, polite, eerily cheerful. "You need to open the door, Jason. Checkout is at 11 a.m., but guests need to settle their accounts before then." It was the woman from the office, but her voice sounded off. Too flat, like someone reading from a script without understanding the words. "I already paid," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Additional fees apply," she replied. "For extended stays." "I've been here 4 hours." "Extended stays," she repeated, exactly the same inflection. "Additional fees apply. Please open the door, Jason." I didn't respond. The handle turned again, harder this time, rattling against the lock. "Jason Merrick, room 12, check-in February 8th, 2020. Please open the door." I grabbed my bag, pulled on my boots, and moved to the window on the far side of the room. It was old, painted shut, but I forced it open, the frame cracking, cold air rushing in. Behind me, I heard the door lock click. I didn't look back. I climbed through the window, dropped into the snow, and ran for my truck. Behind me, I heard the door to room 12 open, heard those slow footsteps following. I reached my truck, fumbled with the keys, got the engine started. In the rearview mirror, I saw the woman standing in front of room 12, illuminated by the flickering lot lights, still smiling, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. and behind her, filling the doorway to room 11, was a figure, tall, thin, wrong. Its proportions were off, limbs too long, movements too fluid. It stepped out into the lot, and even from a distance, I could see it had the same unblinking eyes, the same frozen smile. I threw the truck into gear and drove. I didn't stop until I reached Mattawa, didn't look back until I was surrounded by streetlights and traffic and people. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the steering wheel. I reported the incident to the OPP the next day, told them about the motel, the woman, the voice from room 11. They sent officers to check. Cedar Motor Lodge didn't exist. The location I described, Highway 17, 40 kilometers west of Mattawa, was just empty forest. No motel, no buildings, no signs. The GPS coordinates I provided from my truck's log system pointed to undeveloped crown land. But when I checked my phone, when I looked at the photos I'd taken of the motel sign and my room key, they were there. Clear, undeniable evidence that the place existed, at least when I was there. The key itself was real, solid metal with Cedar Motor Lodge, room 12 engraved on the tag. I still have it. I did research, talked to older truckers who'd been running Highway 17 for decades. A few of them remembered Cedar Motor Lodge, said it had been a real place, operating from the late 60s until it burned down in 1987. 3 people died in the fire: the owner, her daughter, and a guest who'd been staying in room 11. The guest's name was Thomas Corrigan, a traveling salesman. His body was found in his room, but the condition didn't match fire damage. He'd been there for weeks, maybe months, decomposed to the point where identification was only possible through dental records. But the motel records showed he'd checked in the night of the fire. The owner's daughter, Pauline Becker, survived the fire initially, suffered severe burns and smoke inhalation. She died 2 days later in hospital, but witnesses said she kept repeating the same phrases over and over. Checkout is at 11 a.m. Additional fees apply. Please settle your account. Officially, I had a strange experience, possibly driven by exhaustion and the power of suggestion after hearing ghost stories about Highway 17. The motel I stayed at was a hallucination, a waking dream, something my tired brain constructed. But I have the key. I have the photos. And I remember the voice from room 11. The desperation in those words. I slept. I've been here so long. I believe Cedar Motor Lodge still exists, in whatever form burned places take when they refuse to let go. I believe Pauline Becker is still running that front desk, still smiling, still checking in guests who will never check out. And I believe Thomas Corrigan is still in room 11, trapped there since 1987, knocking on walls, trying to warn people like me before we fall asleep and become permanent residents. I don't drive Highway 17 anymore. I take routes that add hours to my trips, avoid that stretch entirely, because I know now that some roadside motels aren't stops on your journey. They're destinations you never leave. If you see a motel that looks decades out of place, if the person at the desk doesn't blink, if something tells you to keep driving, listen to that instinct. Don't check in. Don't stay the night. Because some rooms are waiting for guests. And once you close your eyes, you might wake up to find decades have passed, and you're still there, knocking on walls, trying to warn the next person who makes your mistake. The radio signals shouldn't have been broadcasting. I was sitting in the maintenance shed at the base of Tower 47C, running diagnostic tests on the transmission equipment, when I picked up a voice on frequency 161.375 MHz, a maritime distress channel that had no business being active 60 kilometers inland from Lake Superior. The voice was calm, professional, delivering a mayday call. This is the vessel Northern Passage, position 48.7 north, 88.3 west, taking on water, requesting immediate assistance. 4 souls aboard. This is the vessel Northern Passage. The transmission repeated, looping every 30 seconds. Exactly the same words, exactly the same inflection. The problem was simple and deeply wrong. There was no vessel called Northern Passage in any current registry, and the coordinates being broadcast placed it on land, directly beneath the communications tower where I was sitting. My name is Trevor Walsh. I'm 46, and I'd been working as a telecommunications technician for Norcom Systems for 12 years when I encountered this signal. My job involved maintaining cell and radio towers across northwestern Ontario, climbing structures, replacing equipment, troubleshooting signal issues. It was solitary work, often in remote locations, but I liked it. Paid well, kept me outdoors, and I was good at solving technical problems. Tower 47C was located on a low plateau inland from Marathon, Ontario, part of the network providing coverage for Highway 17 and the surrounding wilderness. The tower itself was 80 meters tall, a standard lattice design, and I'd been dispatched there in April 2018 because multiple users had reported interference and strange signal degradation in the area. I'd expected to find a bad connection, corroded equipment, maybe wildlife damage. Instead, I found that broadcast. I recorded the signal on my equipment, verified the frequency, and confirmed the coordinates it was transmitting. Then I pulled up historical records, trying to identify the Northern Passage. What I found was disturbing. The Northern Passage had been a commercial fishing trawler operating on Lake Superior in the 1970s. On November 9, 1976, it departed Thunder Bay with 4 crew members and never returned. The Coast Guard conducted an extensive search based on the vessel's last known position, but no wreckage, no survivors, and no bodies were ever recovered. The ship and crew were declared lost at sea. The coordinates in the Mayday call were the last position the Northern Passage had transmitted before vanishing. But those coordinates weren't on Lake Superior. They were inland in what was now dense forest at the exact location where Tower 47C was built in 1983. I sat in that shed, listening to the looping Mayday call, trying to understand how a signal from a ship that disappeared 42 years ago was transmitting through equipment that didn't exist when the ship vanished. The signal couldn't be a recording someone was broadcasting as a hoax. The frequency was restricted, the location was remote, and the broadcast power suggested it was coming from within Tower 47C's transmission system itself. Like the tower had somehow captured and stored the original distress call and was now replaying it. I reported the signal to my supervisor, sent him the recording, and asked for guidance. His response was blunt. Fix the interference, stop the unauthorized broadcast, and move on to the next site. He didn't want to hear theories about ghost ships or impossible transmissions. So I climbed the tower. 80 meters is a long climb, even with proper equipment and harness protocols. The wind was strong that day, pushing against the tower, making the whole structure sway slightly. But I'm experienced, and I needed to physically inspect the transmission arrays to identify the source of the signal. At the 60-meter platform, I found something that shouldn't have been there. Tangled in the lattice framework, wedged between support beams, were pieces of fishing net, old rotted netting tangled with rusted buoys and fragments of wood that looked like they'd come from a boat. At 80 meters, inland, on a tower that wasn't built until 7 years after the Northern Passage vanished. I pulled some of the netting free, examined it closely. It was real, physical, decayed by age and weather, and scratched into one of the wooden fragments carved deep into the grain was a name. In. Passage. My hands were shaking as I radioed down to the shed, reporting what I'd found. But there was no response, just static. I tried my cell phone. No signal, even though I was standing on a communications tower specifically designed to provide signal. That's when I heard the sound. Metal groaning, deep and resonant, like a ship's hull under stress. It came from below. From inside the tower structure, rising up through the lattice like the tower itself was twisting, bending, experiencing forces it wasn't designed to handle. And I heard voices, muffled, distant, calling out in confusion and fear. "Get the pumps running! She's going down! Where's the shore? I can't see the shore." The tower swayed, harder than wind alone could explain, and I clung to the platform railing, my harness straining. Below me, through the gaps in the lattice, I saw something impossible. Water. Dark, churning water, visible through the framework like the tower was standing in the middle of a storm-tossed lake. Waves crashed against the lower structure, spray rising, the sound of wind and water overwhelming. But I could still see the ground far below, the maintenance shed, my truck, the forest. Two realities occupying the same space, overlapping, both equally solid. The Mayday broadcast was screaming now from every speaker in my headset, overlapping, echoing, dozens of voices all repeating the same call. "This is the vessel Northern Passage, taking on water, 4 souls aboard, requesting immediate assistance." I descended as fast as safety allowed, practically sliding down the ladder sections, my heart hammering. The sounds of the ship, the groaning metal, the shouting crew, the rushing water, followed me down, growing louder, more frantic. At the 30-meter mark, I saw them. 4 figures clinging to the tower structure, soaked and desperate, their faces pale and eyes wide with terror. They were dressed in 1970s work clothes, fishermen's gear, and they were screaming, reaching for me, begging for help. "Please, you have to help us," one shouted. "We're sinking. We can't find the shore." I kept descending, forced myself not to stop, not to engage. They weren't real, couldn't be real, but one of them grabbed my ankle as I passed. His hand was ice cold, solid, real. His grip was desperate, pulling me toward the edge of the platform. "You have to take us to shore," he pleaded, his voice breaking. "We've been here so long, we can't find the shore." I kicked free, his hand slipping away, and I dropped the final 10 meters faster than I should have, hitting the ground hard, rolling, scrambling to my feet. The tower above me was groaning, swaying, water pouring from impossible spaces, and the 4 figures were climbing down, following me, their movements jerky and wrong. I ran for my truck, threw my equipment in the back, and drove away from Tower 47C without looking back. I reported equipment failure, structural instability, and recommended immediate site decommissioning. Norcom sent a different crew out 2 days later. They found the tower intact, stable, fully functional. No interference, no unauthorized broadcasts, no fishing nets in the structure. But they did note one anomaly. Several of the tower's bolts and welds showed advanced corrosion, consistent with long-term saltwater exposure, 80 kilometers inland. I researched the history of the site more thoroughly after that. The location where Tower 47C stands is on what used to be Lake Superior coastline, 10,000 years ago, when glacial lake levels were higher. Ancient shoreline ridges run through that forest, remnants of a time when water covered what is now dry land. And I learned that coordinates can be wrong. The Northern Passage's last transmission might have been garbled by storm interference, distorted by equipment failure. The Coast Guard searched where they thought the ship was, but maybe the Northern Passage was never on the lake proper. Maybe it had been driven inland by a rogue wave, grounded on a shoal that shouldn't have existed, trapped between water and shore in a place that hadn't been lake for millennia. Maybe when they built Tower 47C in 1983, they anchored it to the same rock where the Northern Passage had died 7 years earlier. And the tower became a conduit, transmitting not just cellular signals but echoes of the ship's final moments. Officially, the interference at Tower 47C was resolved. The site remains operational. But I won't go back there. I requested permanent reassignment away from that region, and I don't take contracts near Lake Superior anymore. I believe the Northern Passage is still sinking, trapped in a moment that never ends, transmitting its mayday through any equipment that touches the place where it died. And I believe those 4 crew members are still trying to find the shore, climbing anything that rises above the water they're still drowning in. If you work on communications towers, if you pick up signals that shouldn't exist, if you hear voices calling for help from places where no one should be, document it, report it, but don't investigate. Because some transmissions aren't reaching out to the living, they're reaching out from places where the dead are still dying, over and over, waiting for rescue that will never come. The footprint stopped mid-stride. I was 3 kilometers into Sleeping Giant Provincial Park's Kabayun Trail, checking conditions after a spring snow melt, when I found them. Clear boot prints in the mud, a person's gait visible in the impressions, walking steadily along the path. Then, at a completely unremarkable section of trail, they simply ended. Not like the person had turned around, not like they'd jumped or been picked up. The prints just stopped existing, both feet mid-step, like whoever had been walking had ceased to be in the middle of their stride. My name is Kayla Redsky. I'm 32, and I work as a park ranger for Ontario Parks, assigned to the Sleeping Giant region north of Thunder Bay. I grew up in the area. I'm Anishinaabe, and I know these trails better than most people know their own neighborhoods. I've spent over a decade hiking, patrolling, and conducting search and rescue in this park, and I thought I'd seen every type of trail anomaly possible. I was wrong. It was May 2021. The park had just opened for the season, and I was doing a solo patrol to assess trail damage from winter freeze-thaw cycles. The Kabayun Trail is one of the park's most popular routes, a challenging 40-kilometer loop that takes hikers along the edge of the Sleeping Giant Peninsula, offering stunning views of Lake Superior. It's well-marked, well-maintained, and we rarely have incidents. The footprints were fresh, made within the past few hours, based on the mud consistency. They belonged to someone wearing hiking boots, probably size 10 or 11, moderate weight based on depth. The stride was normal, relaxed, someone walking at a comfortable pace. Then they ended. I crouched down, examined the final prints closely. Both feet were planted fully, weight distributed evenly, mid-step pattern. The next step should have been 30 inches ahead, but there was nothing, just undisturbed mud, as if the person had evaporated between footfalls. I looked around for alternate explanations. Had they jumped to a rock? No rocks nearby. Climbed a tree? The nearest tree was 5 meters away, and there were no drag marks or hand impressions. Backtracked in their own prints? Impossible. The impressions showed clear forward motion, and there were no doubled patterns. I radioed park headquarters, reported the anomaly, and requested additional rangers to help me search the area. While I waited, I followed the trail back, tracing the footprints to their origin. They started as abruptly as they ended. 1 kilometer south, at a section of trail near a small stream crossing, the prints simply appeared. First step already complete. No evidence of how the person had arrived at that point. They hadn't walked out of the forest, hadn't come from the parking area, hadn't arrived by any normal means. They had just begun existing, then walked for a kilometer, then stopped existing. 2 other rangers arrived, Marcus Holt and Jennifer Sawyer, both experienced backcountry personnel. We conducted a systematic search of a 2-kilometer radius around the disappearance point, looking for any sign of where the hiker might have gone. We found nothing. No broken branches, no disturbed undergrowth, no clothing or gear, no signs of struggle or accident. We filed a report, flagged the area as under investigation, and increased patrols on Kabayun Trail for the next week. But we had no missing person report that matched, no abandoned vehicles in the parking lot, no worried family members calling to report an overdue hiker. Whoever had made those prints was a ghost in our system. No one reported them missing because, officially, they'd never been there. Then, 3 weeks later, it happened again. different location on the same trail about 5 kilometers from the first site. This time, a family hiking the loop found the prints and reported them immediately. Same pattern, footprints appearing out of nowhere, walking for roughly a kilometer, then stopping mid-stride. But this time, there was something else. At the point where the prints ended, carved into a tree beside the trail, was a message. Trail is loop. Cannot find end. How many times? The carving was fresh, done with a knife or sharp tool. Letters crude and desperate. We investigated, brought in tracking specialists from outside the park, consulted with anthropologists and search and rescue experts. No one could explain the prints or the message. Then an elder from Fort William First Nation, a man named Thomas Bocage, who'd lived near the sleeping giant his whole life, came to talk to us. He'd heard about the incidents through community networks, and he wanted to share a story. The sleeping giant is Nanabojo, Thomas explained, referring to the Anishinaabe cultural hero and trickster spirit. He's lying down in the lake, turned to stone, watching over the silver deposits on the peninsula. The old stories say that Nanabojo's spirit still walks those trails, still protects the land, but he also tests people who come here. Some people, they walk into his dreams. They step onto the trail and they're not walking in the real world anymore. They're walking in the space between, in the giant's dreaming. What happens to them? I asked. Thomas looked at me with sad, knowing eyes. They walk forever. They think they're making progress, think they're getting somewhere, but they're just looping through the same path over and over. The trail doesn't end because they're trapped in a circle. Sometimes they realize it, sometimes they don't. But either way, they can't leave. How do we help them? Jennifer asked. You can't, Thomas said simply. Once the giant has you in his dream, you're his until he decides to let you go. All you can do is stay off the trails when the boundary is thin, when his dreaming is closest to the waking world. When is that? I asked. Early morning, late evening, times when light is changing, when the world is between states. And spring, right after the ice breaks, when the land is waking up after winter. That's when the boundary is thinnest. The incidents continued through that spring and into summer, always on Cabellon Trail, always the same pattern. We started finding more messages carved into trees, scratched into rocks. Passed this tree 6 times. Why? Lake never gets closer. Walking wrong direction. How long have I been here? Phone says May 3 was May 3, yesterday. We closed sections of the trail, put up warning signs, tried to intercept hikers before they entered the affected areas. But the footprints kept appearing, different sizes, different gaits, different people all trapped in the same loop. In August 2021, we found the first body, a hiker named Martin Kowalski, age 47, from Toronto. He was sitting against a tree just off the trail, maybe 10 meters into the forest. He'd been dead for at least a week, but his pack was beside him, his water bottles full, his food untouched. Cause of death was determined to be dehydration and exhaustion, but the medical examiner couldn't explain why he hadn't consumed any of his supplies. Martin's phone was in his pocket, still had 60% battery. The last entry in his notes app was dated May 9th, 2021, 3 months before we found his body. I've been walking for 23 hours straight. The trail should have brought me back to the parking lot 18 hours ago. I keep passing the same landmarks, the same bent tree, the same rock formation, the same carved sign. I'm walking in circles, but I can't figure out how. The trail is clearly marked. I'm following the markers, but I keep ending up at the same places. The sun hasn't moved. It's been sunset for hours. I don't understand what's happening. That was his last entry. But his phone's metadata showed he'd been attempting to add new entries for weeks after that date. Trying to open the app, trying to type, but nothing recorded. Like he'd been trying to document his experience, but couldn't break through whatever was holding him. We found 3 more bodies over the next year, all on or near Cabeyun Trail, all showing the same pattern. Long-term exposure and exhaustion, despite having adequate supplies. Phones and journals showing temporal discrepancies, messages indicating they'd been walking in loops they couldn't escape. Ontario Parks conducted a formal investigation, brought in geologists to test for magnetic anomalies, psychologists to assess mass hysteria possibilities, technology experts to check for GPS interference. No conclusive findings. The official position is that Cabeyun Trail has experienced a series of tragic accidents involving hikers who became disoriented, possibly due to medical conditions or substance use, and who subsequently died from exposure. But those of us who work there know better. I've walked that trail dozens of times since the incidents began, but never alone, never during dawn or dusk, never in spring. And I've seen things I can't explain, shadows moving between trees that have no source, the sound of footsteps behind me on empty trail sections, the feeling of walking much longer than my GPS says I've walked. I believe Thomas Bocage. I believe the sleeping giant is more than geology, more than a provincial park. I believe there are spaces on that peninsula where you can step out of the world we know and into something older, something that operates by different rules. And I believe people are still trapped in that loop, still walking, still trying to find the parking lot, the end of the trail, the exit that never comes. Cabeyun Trail remains open, but sections are now marked with additional warnings about disorientation and the importance of hiking with partners. We've installed emergency beacons at intervals, added more frequent trail markers, increased ranger patrols. But the footprints still appear. The messages still get carved. And every spring, when the ice breaks and the land wakes up, we find the boundary is thin again. If you hike Sleeping Giant Provincial Park, respect the land. Make offerings if you know how. And if you start to feel like you're walking in circles, like the trail is repeating, like the sun isn't moving the way it should, stop, turn around, walk back the way you came, and don't stop until you reach your car. Because once you're in the loop, once you're walking in Nana Bojo's dream, time doesn't work right, and the trail doesn't end. You'll just keep walking until your body gives out, leaving behind footprints that appear and disappear. Messages carved into trees, and the desperate hope that someone will understand what happened to you. The basement tenant hadn't made a sound in 3 weeks. That's what bothered me most. Not that I hadn't seen him, but that I hadn't heard him. The apartment was directly below mine in a converted Victorian house in downtown Sudbury, and the floors were thin enough that I usually heard everything. Footsteps, running water, the muffled sound of television. But for 3 weeks, there had been complete silence. And his car was still in the driveway. His mailbox was overflowing. But when I knocked on his door, when I called his phone, there was never any response. My name is Rachel Dunn. I'm 28, and I'd been living in the second-floor apartment at 847 Elm Street for about 6 months when this happened. It was October 2017. I was working as a graphic designer from home, and I liked the house. Old but charming. Cheap rent. Quiet neighborhood. The basement apartment had been vacant when I moved in, but in early September, a man named Owen Marsh moved into it. Owen was maybe 40, quiet, polite in our brief interactions. He worked night shifts at one of the mines outside the city, so our schedules rarely overlapped. I'd see him leaving around 8 p.m. and returning around 7 a.m., then presumably sleeping during the day. I barely heard him, barely knew he was there, until I stopped hearing him entirely. September 24th was the last time I heard sounds from downstairs. After that, nothing. His car stayed parked, his lights never turned on, and the house felt different. Heavier, like the air pressure had changed. By mid-October, I was genuinely worried. I contacted the landlord, a man named Bert Levine, who lived across the city. Bert was dismissive at first, said Owen had paid rent through December and that what tenants did in their units was their business as long as they weren't causing damage. But I pressed, explained the situation, and finally Bert agreed to do a welfare check. We went down together on October 18th. Bert knocked, called out, used his key to unlock the door. The apartment was empty. Not just vacant, empty. No furniture, no belongings, no sign anyone had ever lived there. The rooms were bare, the walls were marked with old nail holes and paint stains. The floor was dusty and undisturbed. Bert stood in the doorway, confused. "Where's his stuff?" "He had furniture," I insisted. I helped him carry a couch in when he moved in. He had boxes, a bed, kitchen things. Bert walked through the apartment slowly, checking each room. "There's nothing here." "Are you sure he actually moved in? Maybe he changed his mind, took the stuff back out?" "I heard him," I said. "I heard him walking around, heard water running, heard his TV, for 3 weeks." Bert looked at me with something between concern and suspicion. "Rachel, there's no one here. There's no evidence anyone's been here in months." But I knew what I'd heard. I knew Owen Marsh had been living in that apartment. Bert left, and I went back upstairs, deeply unsettled. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe Owen had moved out in the middle of the night, taken everything while I was asleep or out. Maybe I'd been mistaken about the sounds. That night, I heard footsteps from below. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving through the empty basement apartment. Walking from the bedroom to the kitchen, pausing, walking to the bathroom. The same pattern Owen had walked when he lived there. But the apartment was empty. I'd seen it empty. I grabbed a flashlight and went downstairs, my heart hammering. The basement door was closed but unlocked. I opened it and shone my light inside. Empty. Completely empty. But I could still hear the footsteps. They were coming from inside the apartment, moving across the bare floor, clear and distinct. I backed out, closed the door, and returned to my apartment. I didn't sleep that night. The footsteps continued for weeks. Every night, the same pattern. Footsteps, running water, the faint sound of a television. Sounds of occupancy coming from an apartment I knew was vacant. I researched the house, dug into property records and local history. 847 Elm Street had been built in 1904, had changed hands multiple times, had been divided into apartments in the 1970s. And in 1983, something had happened. A tenant named Michael Farrell had lived in the basement apartment. He'd worked night shifts at Inco's Fruit Mine, same as Owen. In November 1983, Michael had disappeared. He'd left for work one evening and never arrived. His car was found parked at the mine. His equipment locker was locked. His time card wasn't punched, but Michael Farrell was gone. The investigation concluded he'd likely left voluntarily, possibly to escape debts or personal problems. His belongings were removed from the apartment and his case went cold. But according to archived newspaper articles, several subsequent tenants of that basement apartment reported strange experiences. Sounds of someone moving through the rooms, the smell of cigarette smoke. Michael had been a smoker. The feeling of being watched, items moving on their own. 2 tenants had left within weeks of moving in, refusing to explain why. Another tenant, a woman named Sandra Yates, had told the landlord she'd seen a man in the apartment late at night standing in the corner of her bedroom, watching her. She'd called police, but no one was found. The apartment had been vacant for years at a time between tenants. I talked to an older neighbor, a woman named Edith Krause, who'd lived on Elm Street since the 1970s. She remembered Michael Farrell, remembered when he disappeared. That basement had problems before Michael, Edith told me. Back in the 60s, a man drowned down there. Pipes burst during winter, flooded the whole apartment while he was sleeping, and he never woke up. Drowned in his own basement. They fixed the pipes, cleaned it up, rented it again. But people always said the place felt wrong, felt like someone was still there. "Do you think Michael left?" I asked. "Or do you think something happened to him?" Edith looked at me seriously. "I think that basement keeps people. I think it took that man who drowned, and it took Michael, and it tries to take anyone who stays too long. That's why people leave, because they feel it trying to hold on to them." I went to the police, reported Owen Marsh missing, gave them all the information I had. They investigated, but they found no record of Owen Marsh. The name didn't appear in any employment records. The mining company had no employee by that name, and the car registered to the address belonged to a different person entirely. It was like Owen Marsh had never existed outside of my interactions with him. I moved out of 847 Elm Street in November 2017. I broke my lease, forfeited my deposit, and left. The footsteps were growing louder. The feeling of being watched had spread from the basement to my own apartment, and I'd started having dreams of drowning, of water rising in dark rooms, of someone calling my name from below. Bert Levine rented the basement apartment again in early 2018 to a young man named Tyler Hughes. Tyler lasted 5 days before he left in the middle of the night, leaving all his belongings behind. When Bert went to check the apartment, it was empty again. No furniture, no belongings, no Tyler. Tyler Hughes was reported missing by his family. Police investigated. No trace of him was found. Officially, 847 Elm Street is just an old house with a high tenant turnover rate. The basement apartment is currently vacant and has been for over a year, but I believe that apartment is occupied. I believe Michael Farrell never left, and neither did Owen Marsh or Tyler Hughes. I believe that space has become something that exists outside normal time, that it traps people in a state of permanent occupancy, and that anyone who lives there long enough becomes part of it. I drive past 847 Elm Street sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, and I see lights in the basement windows. I see shadows moving behind the curtains. I see a man standing at the glass, looking out, watching the street. And I wonder how many people are down there now, trapped in apartments that don't exist, living lives that loop forever, unable to leave. If you're looking for a cheap basement apartment, if the rent seems too good to be true, ask about the history. Ask about previous tenants. Ask why the place has been vacant, because some apartments don't let you leave. And once you're trapped inside, you become part of the house, part of the space between walls, part of the permanent collection of residents who checked in but never checked out. Good evening, everyone. Tonight, we walk the ancient spine of the Appalachian Mountains. That's what stopped me at the entrance to Hollinger Mines Shaft Number 9. The sound of machinery, the distant whir of cables and motors, the unmistakable operation of an elevator descending into a mine that had been closed for 40 years. I was standing at the old head frame in Timmins, documenting industrial heritage sites for a provincial archive project, and Hollinger Mine was supposed to be dead, sealed, silent. No power, no equipment, no reason for anything to be moving. But I could hear it. Deep inside the shaft, something was running. My name is David Kerr. I'm 51, and I work as an industrial archaeologist, photographing and documenting defunct mining operations across northern Ontario. It's solitary work, often physically demanding, and it requires accessing dangerous locations. But I'm careful. I follow safety protocols, and I've never had a serious incident. Hollinger Mine was one of the most productive gold mines in Canadian history, operating from 1910 until 1968. At its peak, it employed thousands and produced millions of ounces of gold from an underground network that extended over 5,000 feet deep and 10,000 feet laterally. When it closed, most of the surface infrastructure was dismantled, but some head frames and buildings remained as historical landmarks. Shaft number 9 was one of the last active shafts used until final closure. It had been sealed with concrete caps and steel grating, restricted access, clear warnings about unstable ground and toxic gases. But standing at the fence on that November afternoon in 2015, I could hear machinery operating deep below. I should have reported it to authorities and left. Should have assumed someone was conducting unauthorized salvage operations or illegal exploration. But I was curious, and I wanted to document whatever was happening before it was shut down. I climbed the fence, crossed the deteriorated ground around the head frame, and approached the shaft entrance. The concrete cap had been removed, stacked neatly to the side. The steel grating was pulled back. The shaft was open, and light was visible far below. A warm, yellowish glow that flickered like lanterns. I called down into the shaft. "Hello? Anyone down there?" My voice echoed, descending into the depths, and for a moment there was silence. Then, faint and distant, I heard a response. "Come down, we're still working." The voice was matter-of-fact, calm, like someone calling a co-worker to join them. I hesitated, every instinct telling me this was wrong. But the elevator cage was visible at the shaft entrance, cables taut, platform steady. It looked operational, maintained, safe. I stepped onto the cage. The moment my weight settled on the platform, the elevator began descending without me touching any controls. Smooth, automatic, like it had been waiting for me. I should have jumped off immediately, should have scrambled back to surface, but I didn't. I rode that elevator down into Hollinger Mines Shaft 9, watching the levels pass. Markers showing 500 feet, 1,000 feet, 1,500 feet, descending into a mine that shouldn't have had power, shouldn't have had light, shouldn't have had people working. At 2,100 feet, the elevator stopped. The gate opened automatically, and I stepped out onto a level that looked like it had been frozen in time. The tunnel was fully lit with electric lights. The rails were clear and maintained. Ore carts sat on the tracks. Tools were arranged along the walls, and I could hear sounds deeper in the tunnel, the ring of hammers on rock, the scrape of shovels, voices calling back and forth. I walked toward the sounds, my camera recording everything. The air was warm, humid, smelled of earth and sweat and something else. Tobacco smoke, oil, the scent of a working mine. Around a bend in the tunnel, I found them, men working. Dozens of them, maybe 40 or 50, dressed in old-style mining clothes. Canvas pants, heavy shirts, suspenders, cloth caps. They were drilling, loading ore, pushing carts, working with the efficient rhythm of experienced miners. But their movements were wrong. Repetitive, looping, like watching a film on repeat. One man would swing his hammer, strike the rock face, lift the hammer, swing again, exact same motion, exact same angle, over and over. Another would load a cart with ore, push it 10 feet down the track, return, load the same cart again, push it to the same spot. They were working, but they weren't making progress. They were trapped in actions that looped endlessly. I approached the nearest man, a thin miner with a deeply lined face, covered in rock dust. "Excuse me, what's going on here?" He turned to look at me, and his eyes were empty. Not blind, not dead, just empty, like there was nothing behind them. "Working," he said flatly. "Always working." "The mine's been closed since 1968, I said. "You shouldn't be here." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "No, still open, still producing. We have quotas." "Quotas for what?" "For the company. Always quotas. Always more gold. Can't stop. Can't leave until quotas are met." He turned back to his work, swinging his hammer, striking the same spot on the wall over and over. I backed away, my skin crawling, and continued down the tunnel. More miners, all performing the same looping actions, all with that same empty expression. Some nodded at me as I passed, polite but vacant. Others didn't acknowledge me at all, too focused on their endless, pointless work. At the end of the tunnel, I found a supervisor's station, a small office carved into the rock, desk and chair, bulletin board covered with production charts and work orders, all dated 1967. Sitting at the desk was a man in better clothes, Maybe a foreman or shift boss. He was filling out paperwork, writing numbers in columns, tallying figures. When I entered, he looked up and smiled. "You're new. Transfer from which shaft?" "I'm not a miner," I said. "I'm documenting the site. The mine's been closed for decades." The foreman frowned, confused. "Closed?" "No. We're running full production. Best year we've had. Management wants these numbers by end of shift." "What shift?" I asked. "What year do you think it is?" "It's 1967, November. We're pushing to hit the annual quota before the inspectors come." He looked at me with genuine concern. "Are you feeling all right? Maybe you should see the medical station." I realized then what I was seeing. These men weren't squatters or trespassers. They were ghosts, echoes, trapped in the final years of the mine's operation, endlessly reliving their shifts, unable to comprehend that the mine had closed, that they'd been working in place for 50 years. "You need to stop," I said quietly. "You need to go home. The mine is closed. There's no quota anymore." The foreman stood up, his expression hardening. "We can't stop. Management says we can't stop. Quota has to be met. If we don't meet quota, the mine closes. We lose our jobs. Our families need us working." "The mine closed," I said again. 47 years ago. You've been here too long. You need to let go." He looked at me with sudden, terrible clarity, and for just a moment, his eyes weren't empty anymore. They were filled with fear and sadness and understanding. "We know," he whispered. "We know it's been too long. We know we're not supposed to be here anymore. But we don't know how to leave. We don't remember the way up." Behind me, I heard footsteps. The miners were gathering, dozens of them filling the tunnel, all staring at me with those empty eyes. And I understood. They'd been trapped so long that they'd forgotten what life outside the mine was like, forgotten that there was an outside at all. One of them spoke, his voice echoing through the crowd. "Show us the way. Take us up." I ran. I pushed through the miners, back down the tunnel toward the elevator. They followed, slowly at first, then faster, calling out, pleading. "Wait! Don't leave us! Show us how to get out!" I reached the elevator, slammed the gate closed, hit the emergency ascent switch. The cage lurched upward, rising through the shaft, and I watched the level markers flash past, 2,100, 2,000, now 900, climbing toward the surface. Below me, I could see them gathered at the tunnel entrance, watching me rise, their faces upturned, still calling. I reached the surface, stumbled off the elevator, and collapsed beside the headframe. The elevator cage descended immediately, returning to the depths, and I heard the sounds resume below, the hammering, the scraping, the voices. I reported what I'd found to provincial authorities, told them there were people in the mine, that it needed to be investigated. They sent a team down. Shaft 9 was sealed, flooded decades ago. The elevator system had been dismantled in 1970. The 2,100-foot level was inaccessible, full of water and collapsed tunnels. But my camera had recorded everything. The tunnel, the lights, the miners. It was all there on video. The authorities dismissed it as visual glitches, recording artifacts, maybe gas-induced hallucinations. Hollinger mine was permanently sealed with additional concrete and steel after my report. But I know what I saw. I know those men are still down there, still working, still trapped in shifts that never end, still trying to meet quotas that no longer matter. And I believe they're not unique. I believe there are mines all across northern Ontario where men worked themselves to exhaustion, where accidents took lives, where the constant demand for production created places so soaked in labor and death that they can't let go. Officially, Hollinger Mine is a decommissioned industrial site, a piece of history that's safely sealed and inactive. But on quiet nights in Timmins, people report hearing sounds from the old head frames, hammering, machinery, voices calling from underground. And sometimes, lights are visible deep in the sealed shafts, warm and yellow, like lanterns carried by men who don't know the shift has ended. If you work in mining, if you explore industrial heritage sites, if you hear machinery running in places that should be silent, don't investigate. Don't go down. Because some mines never close, some shifts never end, and some workers are still trying to meet quotas that were set before they died, trapped in darkness, waiting for someone to show them the way back to light.